So when Benjamin Franklin left what we now call the Constitutional Convention, but I'm going to call the Philadelphia Convention, when he left the convention, he met Elizabeth Willing Powell, who was a highly educated and politically astute a woman in Philadelphia. And she asked him, you've probably heard this story, Dr. Franklin, what kind of government have you given us? A republic or a monarchy? And Franklin rather famously replied, a republic if you can keep it. So what Franklin meant and what Powell understood is that republics are by their nature very fragile. So republics are not held together by racial or ethnic identity or by military force or the cult of personality of a leader or religious coercion. Today, our nation is bound together not by any of those things, but by a set of ideas about civic society embodied in the founding documents that you've been studying, the Declaration of Independence, tonight the Constitution, and next week the Bill of Rights. Franklin and Powell had great faith in Republican government in the context of the 18th century. And they understood that the country designed in the Philadelphia Convention would endure only if citizens were educated, if they kept informed about public events, as Teeks describes it, and they were community-minded. So educated, informed citizens needed to put aside their private interest and reason together to elect representatives who would seek society's best interest. And that's a concept of civic virtue. It's really the bedrock of Republican government or representative democracy as idealized by Franklin, Powell, and other members of the founding generation. And it connects to your Teeks standards about rights and responsibilities of citizenship. So we have rights under the Constitution, but we also, as citizens in a republic, have responsibility to be educated, to be civically engaged, and to practice civic virtue. And I think to a great degree, the Philadelphia Convention was an exercise in civic virtue of reasoning together to reach consensus on the common good, even when it required tremendous sacrifice of personal interest. Compromises and consensus seeking are never easy. And as the Philadelphia Convention shows us, they're not very popular, sometimes not very popular. Maybe just back up for a second and say, I'm going to try not to use the Constitutional Convention because only in retrospect was it a constitutional convention. In its design, it was something else, and at the time called the Philadelphia Convention. So it's important to keep our republic today, and it's an important part of our ongoing work of building a more perfect union, to understand the Constitution and its origins. And that's a hard thing to do in the 21st century for several reasons. The first is, we've probably all heard of this in recent years, the Dunning-Kruger effect. So the Dunning-Kruger effect is basically that people who have no knowledge of something have complete confidence in what they think they know. And so if you look at the Dunning-Kruger effect chart, you can see that an expert in the field never has the confidence in their knowledge that somebody who knows nothing about a topic has. And so the way that plays into understandings of the Constitution is, everybody thinks they know what's in the Constitution, but very few people have actually read and considered it and understand its history. And of course, more generally, we're sort of inundated with information today, but knowledge and interpretive skills that's our job to try and instill those. So that's the first reason why it's hard to learn about the Constitution in the 21st century. The second is that the Constitution was designed in the 18th century with a different culture, a different language, and a different kind of society. And I'm going to try something a little interactive. I'm going to stop the share for just a minute. I'm going to see who has their screen on and who might be willing to just for a couple of minutes turn their screen on so we can capture the difference between the 18th century and the 21st. And I do this in my class. But I think it'll work the same with you all. So all of us who are eligible to vote, let's raise our hands. Okay, all right. So now we're in the 21st century. This is the 21st century American Republic. Keep them up, keep them up, keep them up. Ideal of representative democracy. So all of the women have to lower their hands. All of the people of color have to lower their hands. And all of the remaining white men who do not own outright, not a mortgage, but outright, let's say 50 acres of land or $50,000 worth of real estate outright, you could put your hands down. So this is about when I tell my students so much for original intentions, right? So there's a big gap between the original design of representative government in the constitutional period and the nature of representative government in the 21st. So thank you for turning on your screens. And now I'm going to start sharing my slides again, if I can find them. Yeah. Okay. And then the third reason why it's really hard to understand the Constitution today is that it's genuinely complicated. The framers of the Constitution disagreed, sometimes stridently and sometimes inconsistently. They were men from different regions with different points of view and different values in the middle of a political revolution that they could not control and planning for a future that they could not predict. So I want to give you one example. We'll return to it in the source discussion, but one example of the complexity of understanding the Constitution and the disagreements and the shifts over time. So in your state standards, you're supposed to teach students about the concept of limited government. So certainly Madison and Hamilton in their Federalist writings argued that the Constitution created a limited government. And they pointed to Article 1, Section 8 for the enumerated powers. And they said, look, clearly this is a limited government. At the same time, Madison, Hamilton, and other nationalists were championing the Constitution because it created a vigorous and strong national government that would replace the model of state sovereignty in the Articles. So the critics of the Constitution pointed to this clause that we call the necessary and proper clause. That's my underlining and bold. So to critics of the Constitution, this language combined with lifetime appointments for judges, no term limits for elected officials and appointed officials in the federal government, the creation of a powerful chief executive who presided over a standing army, like all of that signaled to them the return of what they had challenged Britain over, limitless government. So depending on who you were listening to in the late 1780s, the Constitution either clearly limited the powers of government or it created an obviously unlimited set of powers for the government. And we've been disagreeing about the nature of limited government, and we've been disagreeing about this necessary and proper clause ever since. I mean, well, I don't want to get into the specifics of current political things because I'm trying to mind my time, but you can think probably about issues in the last 5 to 7 years that have grown directly out of contested meanings of what is necessary and proper under the Constitution. So this is, of course, the room where it happened. The physical space. I don't know if any of you have visited it. It's fantastic. If you haven't, you should try to go to Philly and see it. Connecting to last week's discussion by Woody Holton, this is where delegates went to try to work through the problems of the Articles of Confederation, including, among other things, the inability to change any part of the Articles of Confederation. So I just remind you then, again from Prof. Houghton last week, that the Philadelphia Convention was born out of a conviction of many politically engaged Americans that there were structural problems within the Articles of Confederation that needed some kind of revision. George Washington said, reform of the present system is indispensable. But that left a rather divisive question of what kinds of reforms needed to be made to the Articles of Confederation. And there's a second issue that I think is important to keep in mind. It's not simply the problems or the critiques of the Articles that's driving the Philadelphia meeting, but it's also the successes of the states. So the states were functioning fairly well, many Americans believed, and some elites thought they were operating too well. The states were highly responsive to voters' changing views and opinions, including debtor interest. The structures of the governments within the state were decidedly democratic, and by that I mean small d, just like I mean small r, Republican. So most of the states had annual elections and very strict term limits, which left the representatives in their state governments very much under the sway of citizens. And so when thinking about ways in which the Articles might be revised, there is always a related question about what those reforms to the Articles might mean for the states. So representatives in the Confederation Congress knew people's allegiances to their states, and they knew about the ambitions of the nationalists, men like Washington and Madison and Hamilton, who wanted to create a very strong national government to rein in the states and secure the American Republic. And so the Confederation Congress gave the Philadelphia Convention a very specific and narrow charge. They were to meet for the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation, but so that it could work for the exigencies of the government. So what the Philadelphia delegates did rather quickly once they met in this room was to head out in a new direction to try and preserve representative democracy for the future of the American Republic. But they decided that doing that would require them to move far beyond their lawful charge of revising the Articles. It's really helpful to think about the creation of the Constitution as operating in three different venues with three different cultures. And I'm going to focus mostly on the Philadelphia Convention, but there's the debates in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787. Then there's a second wave of debates within the states in 87, 88 after the plan is unveiled. And then as the states are debating whether or not to accept the Constitution, there's a movement to revise the Constitution and create amendments to it. And that process of creating a Bill of Rights, creating amendments to the original design, takes place in the first Congress in 1789, 1790. And so each of those venues are very distinctive, and they have a very distinct sort of operating culture. So here's the man of the hour, James Madison. He was one of 55 delegates elected to participate in the Philadelphia Convention, but the delegates were never all in that room together all at the same time. They were supposed to start work on May the 14th. This 36-year-old bachelor from Virginia was there early. The Virginians are meeting with the Pennsylvanians. Their delegations are dominated by strong nationalists, and they're creating a game plan to proceed once everyone shows up. But George Washington is getting increasingly frustrated as 2 weeks pass by and a quorum has not yet shown up for the Philadelphia meeting. So we think about the Constitutional Convention as some signal moment in American history. But if we look at the conduct of the delegates, they didn't appear to think that. They weren't sure what they were going to do. They weren't sure that the meeting would succeed. And they certainly didn't know that even if they were successful, if their work would have any staying power for the Republic. When they finally began their work, it was clear that the sort of nationalists outnumbered any other really group or way of thinking in the convention. And those nationalists had a set of goals. They wanted to protect property. They wanted to stabilize the economy, and they wanted to make the United States respectable in the international arena. But they were open to varying ways of achieving those goals. And, you know, Madison is not particularly happy with some of the resolutions, even though they begin working off of what we call, and is his work, the Virginia Plan. Now, from the outset, as the delegates finally arrived in Philadelphia, they generally agreed on a few key points. And here we can begin to see the seeds of the unique nature of the Philadelphia meeting. First of all, they generally agreed that the problems in the Articles of Confederation could not be solved by simply finding a way to amend the Articles. The crises threatening the young country were too thoroughgoing. Congress, they decided, was simply too dependent on the states, especially regarding finance. Second, there was an almost universal determination to rein in the democratic policies being pursued in the states, to support creditors over debtors, and to defend property rights and the political power of elites. And that was, I mean, I can answer in the Q&A why that was so, but I don't want us to have a reflex, reflexive response against that says the Philadelphia meeting is corrupt. There are reasons why the framers thought this way. And then third, they all understood that the country was insolvent in 1787. There were 10 sitting members of the Confederation Congress who served at the Philadelphia Convention. And so they had sort of immediate and firsthand knowledge of the dire straits the country was facing. So despite their very recent history of rebelling against imperial tax policies, the delegates agreed that the new government would require independent authority to collect and spend money. Now, on much else, they disagreed, but they made two important decisions in the first 2 days of the convention that helped them work through their disagreements to reach consensus on the larger issues that they were trying to solve. First of all, they agreed that they would operate on what you would call the committee of the whole. Now, this sounds real boring, and when I start to tell my students about this, they get sleepy. But it's an important lesson about how the ground rules can make all the difference in the world. And so the ground rules of the Philadelphia meeting were that the committee of the whole would be the way they would operate. So they wouldn't pick smaller committees to work through issues of, you know, what the chief executive's job would be, or would there be a standing army, or how would representation be apportioned, and then have those committees come and report and just take an up or down vote. That is not what they would do. Instead, they would work together on really every issue. And when they took votes, it wouldn't be to make anything binding, it would be to gauge the opinion of the room. And any issue that had been previously discussed and debated and even voted on could be raised and discussed again. It was understood from this process that men would change their minds. It was not only acceptable, but it was preferable that they would change their minds over time. Now, it made for a very slow and meandering and very frustrating process. And there were at least 2 times that they thought about scrapping the whole thing. But it mattered a great deal that the Philadelphia Convention would turn not on winning narrow votes, but on appealing to the greatest number of delegates possible and moving them toward consensus. And so you might not know that doesn't usually make its way into the textbooks. The other decision they made that does make its way into the textbooks is that the convention would operate with absolute secrecy. So they wouldn't have to worry about local people weighing in on what they were doing. They wouldn't have to worry about the press reporting on or exaggerating or distorting what they were doing. There would be no external influences because there'd be no external knowledge of what they were doing. Now, none of the factors that made the Philadelphia Convention unique, that they arrived without firm ideas, that they agreed on some key issues, that they operated in a structure that invited consensus, that their proceedings were secret, none of that meant that the convention was harmonious or that it was destined to succeed. The deliberations got tense, especially over the issue of representation. Now, two of the specific objectives in TEACS are the Great Compromise and the 3/5 Compromise. And both of those grow out of the tense debates over representation. What should the new government represent? Citizens or states? And related to that was, where would sovereignty reside? What powers would states retain? What future would slavery hold in the supposedly free American Republic? And all of that was interconnected to issues that for many weeks, men at the convention refused to compromise on. But again, there is that distinct culture. And if you read the Philadelphia debates, you can see that they're sort of trying out ideas. They're revising and abandoning thoughts. They're searching for compromise, and they're working together to arrive at a design of government in its various parts that will serve the larger interests of the nation. So if you want to read them, Yale Law School's Avalon Project, which has a fantastic collection of all sorts of primary sources related to law, history, and diplomacy, has all of James Madison's notes from the Philadelphia Convention pegged by day. So you can click on the first day, May 14, and then you see, look, there's all those blank days until May the 25th, and then something else happened. And then finally on the 28th, there's a quorum and they start to work. But you can read all of the conversations and hear how they operate. So I've embedded in here, I think I won't linger on it just out of an interest of time, but I have transcribed and modernized a short part of the conversation. And these are the men who are participating in that conversation. And this is a transcript of their conversation. And if you go back and look at it later or work through it with your students, you can see that there's a tentativeness and an openness and a divisiveness in the debates in Philadelphia. This is particularly over how to choose a chief executive. And that's an issue that they debated all the way through early September. So whatever sense of compromise that prevailed during the Philadelphia Convention evaporated as soon as this plan was unveiled. Citizens in the states were given no chance to change the plan and a single binary choice, yes or no, to the Constitution. The debates over ratification unfolded in public over about a year and a half, with a highly partisan press inflaming people's tensions and stoking their fears to the point of paranoia. And the men who were voting on whether to accept the Constitution or not knew exactly what they wanted. They either wanted to support the Constitution or they wanted to reject the Constitution. They were either Federalist in support or anti-Federalist against. And so there was no sort of seeking of compromise or consensus. They were adversaries. And so the ratification debates looked a little bit more like this than this. So this is how we'd like to see our history and ourselves. But sometimes, including, I'm afraid to say this week in our own civic life, we act a little bit more like this. So I don't want to get into the Bill of Rights, but that's the third wave of debates that go on in the wake of the ratification debates. Kate Brown will talk about that next week. But I do just want to say that it's worth keeping in mind and reminding our students that today, when Americans think about their most treasured rights, those rights are the result of opposition to the Constitution, and they are changes to the original design that came out of Philadelphia that were forced by the sharpest critics of the Constitution, the people who were most fearful about what it might mean. So returning just in the time I have left to the importance of teaching the Constitution and the challenges of teaching the Constitution, I want to close with some thoughts about turning abstractions into concrete realities that are useful for you and your students. And we can talk more about this in the Q&A or during the source discussion. So separation of powers and checks and balances are parts of a political philosophy based on the assumption that power corrupts. Inevitably, power corrupts. And so power must be balanced among competing interests in order to counter the potential for corruption. And in our federal government today and in our states as well, checks and balances have very complex structures and meanings. So this is a chart which will give you a headache and will put your students to sleep, but it sort of charts how checks and balances are supposed to work under the structure of the Constitution. We have in the last year and a half been immersed in a seminar on how checks and balances actually work and how federalism works as well. So when schools reopen for on-site learning, some require vaccines and some do not, and some have mask mandates and some do not. But when all that happens, who gets to decide? Is it the governor of the state of Texas? Is it the state legislature? Is it the mayor of your city? Is it the school board, the teachers, the unions, the parents, the students, the federal government, or the courts? So I've been following the Texas thing with great interest. And my interest isn't even about the pandemic and the mask mandates. It's about how power gets apportioned and challenged and restructured, and the imaginative ways in which people go about trying to subvert the power of government and pursue their definition of their rights or their definition of public safety. So we're sort of watching on a daily basis checks and balances unfold. The federal system of shared sovereignty, I think, is also very relatable to students. And it's not just when they have to balance what the school board says versus what their teacher says versus what their parents say. But in their day-to-day lives, you know, some parts of their lives are controlled by their parents, and some by their teachers, and some by their coaches, and some by their peers. And so I think they experience shared sovereignty and federalism a lot more often than we sometimes think about. And so finally, let me just say something about the complicated matter of representation. One of your state standards is to emphasize, again, the great compromise over representation in Congress. And when I try to talk to my students about this, you know, they just think, why in the world should I care about what men in powdered wigs thought 234 years ago? So they may not care much about that, but my students care a lot about fairness. They're young enough that they think the world should be fair or that it might be fair. And so that's the hook I use when I try and talk about representation. So if we look at Texas and your neighboring state of Oklahoma, this is how representation is apportioned in the Congress. So both Oklahoma and Texas have 2 senators, equal representation, although Texas has nearly 9 times the number of people and the number of representatives as Oklahoma. I always try to remind them too that today representation is about 1 representative for every 720,000 people. You can look at charts this way. So this is Texas versus Oklahoma in the House on the left, and Texas versus Oklahoma in the Senate on the right. If we add the largest state, California, in terms of population, and the smallest state, Wyoming, in terms of population, we can press further that issue of what is fair for Texas and California, and what is fair for Wyoming and Oklahoma. Should small states have as much say, or does that disfranchise the citizens of the state? And then what about people who live where Denver does, in Washington, D.C.? So the Constitution says that each state will get at least one representative. So there are, what are those? 1, 2, 3, 6 states with less than 1 million people. There's 689,000 plus people living in Washington, D.C., more than in Vermont and more than in Wyoming. And do they get represented? What's fair for them? And so these are sort of some lingering questions I have, including, in the 21st century, is the Great Compromise still a great idea or not? So I hope that you have some questions for me, and I hope that this is useful for you and your students, because, you know, it's our republic now, and it's up to us to decide whether we're going to be able to keep it.